Thanks.
Uh, let's move to Jason with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks, Normand. So I'll do a walkthrough of some recent research we came out with a couple months ago, walking through some key findings. I'm going to try to just hit the main points. There's plenty more detail in the report that I'd encourage you to take a look at. And this is a condensed version of a larger presentation that I've given a few dozen times now. So let me just share my screen, stand by. Okay, so I can't see anyone now. So if you want to stop me along the way, you'll have to speak up. So the title of the report is Canada's Net Zero Future, Finding Our Way in the Global Transition. And with this report, we were aiming to do four things. First, to explore what a net zero 2050 means in practical terms and the pathways that Canada could take to get there. When we set out on this work, the net zero target was a new one in Canada, and there were a lot of understandable questions out there about how achievable is this? What will it mean for Canada? So we set out to put some facts and evidence around that debate. We're also looking to assess uncertainty on the path to net zero, including the effect of factors that Canada does, but also does not control. And really looking to provide, with all of this, an evidence-based touchstone for this nascent net zero policy conversation, sort of a rally point where different points of view, different perspectives could come together and have a more constructive and informed debate on what the future might hold and what smart decisions might look like. And finally, to provide some clarity for decision makers on the role that different specific solutions will or might play on the path to net zero and what that means for policy. So in terms of the methods that went into this, we've done modeling, literature review, expert input, stakeholder consultation, all to inform what is a scenario analysis. So we've looked at over 60 different scenarios where Canada gets to net zero by 2050. And we've really designed and selected these scenarios in order to reflect the uncertainty associated with parts of this transition, including the effect of variables and drivers that are going to make a big difference in terms of what this transition looks like in Canada, but things that aren't always in our control, or at least are only partially in our control. These include things like, so we're varying assumptions across our scenarios in terms of things like, what is the degree and pace of climate policy action in other major countries? What's the cost of key GHG reducing technologies? What is the level of future global oil demand and prices? And what is the availability and cost of negative emissions technologies? So we're focusing on the role of these larger drivers and to a certain extent abstracting from the details of policy in order to focus on these bigger drivers, looking for cost-effective pathways under different possible assumptions and constraints. Now, all these pathways taken together, these 60 plus scenarios, describe the larger possibility space that exists around Canada's net zero transition. Now, that doesn't mean that some of the pathways we look at are equally likely. Certainly some would come with a lot more barriers than others. And I'll just pause here to note that, we've looked at the role of uncertainty, but we have not attributed likelihood to these scenarios. And the reason for that is we started to do that early on in the project cycle and quickly realized that we were inevitably getting pulled into subjective territory. So made a decision to keep things a bit more objective, and rather than attributing likelihood, instead talking about barriers. So whenever there is a given pathway, a potential route, what are all the hurdles associated with that? And really sort of setting up what others would need to make a more informed decision and have a more informed discussion around likelihood and desirability ultimately. So what I'll do in this presentation and what we've done in the report is, rather than zooming in on each of these scenarios, we're going to look across all of them at once to ask, what's consistent? So what shows up again and again, no matter how the transition plays out? And where there are differences, what are the drivers of those differences? So let's walk through a few key findings. The first place to start is that we find that the goal is achievable, and that in fact, many pathways could lead to that net zero goal. So this figure shows just one of those potential pathways. We see the overall path to net zero in the black line, with the colored wedges representing the role that different solutions are playing on the way there. So this is one scenario. Different scenarios in our analysis get there in different ways. So they use solutions like these in different mixes to differing degrees, depending on the specific assumptions and conditions in a given scenario. Now, while the emergence of certain conditions or outcomes could lead to some of our pathways or scenarios proving to not be viable, we can conclude that there are enough potential routes to net zero that we can conclude the goal is achievable. Now, but as Normand said, that does not mean it will be easy. This will be a massive undertaking requiring policy stringency and coordination at a level beyond anything seen to date. So not suggesting anything about this is easy, but rather that if we were to set our mind to it sufficiently, it's something that Canada could achieve. So let's come back to the question of specific solutions and the role that they'll play. And another key finding that we have on this front is that there are what we call safe bets versus wildcards on the path to net zero. Safe bets are those things that are commercially available today and have no major constraints to scaling them up. They're also the things that show up consistently across all of our scenarios. So no matter how the transition plays out, no matter how those uncertain variables I was talking about play out, these things are always there playing a driving role. So they represent no regrets actions and priorities. And it's a familiar list. It includes things like non-emitting electricity, EVs in transportation, heat pumps in buildings, and things like methane management in the industry sector. Now we can contrast the safe bets with the wildcards. Wildcards are those things that are demonstration stage only, so it's early days yet, or where they are commercially available, where there might be questions around how scalable they might prove to be. These things only play a role in our analysis under particular conditions. So examples include things like second generation liquid biofuels in transportation. So moving away from those food-based feedstocks like corn, making them things out of things like switchgrass. So early days for a technology like that, but a lot of promise. RNG and hydrogen in buildings. So it's putting these clean gases in place of natural gas in the gas network or mixing them in. A wildcard technology in that, not that we're pessimistic about their technical viability, but can they always outcompete their alternatives on the path to net zero? That's why we consider them a wildcard. And of course, negative emissions solutions, particularly where they're taken up in the industry sector. A lot of questions around how viable and cost effective and scalable these solutions might prove to be, but a possibility that exists out there and something we consider a wildcard. So let's be a bit more specific. So here are a number of different safe bets and wildcards. Right now, we're looking at GHG reductions in the year 2030. And the darker shaded portion of a circle represents that minimum contribution that we see when we look across all of our scenarios. And the larger area is that larger potential that exists in a subset of scenarios. Now, I'm not going to talk about individual safe bets and wildcards right now, just in the interest of time. But just to note that what our high level finding here is that for 2030, it is all about the safe bets. That safe bets are driving a minimum of 2/3 of the reductions needed to get to that 2030 target, and in some cases as much as 90%. So the point being, we have in hand today what we need for that near-term target. The possibility, the potential of wildcards is not a reason to delay on the safe bets, because even in a best case scenario for all of our wildcards, safe bets are still critical, driving a minimum of 2/3 of the reductions needed to get to 2030. So let's switch this view now to a 2050 view. So bigger reductions, so bigger circles. We can see the safe bets are really ramping up on that timeline. So still a really important contribution coming from those solutions. Wildcards may be also playing a much bigger role, but a much more uncertain one as well. So I'll just talk about a couple here. We have advanced forms of carbon capture and storage. So that's the capture of combustion gas streams, unconcentrated gas streams. A technology for which it's early days, but could make a big impact. And I'll note here that we have the concentrated gas streams version of CCS, which we consider a safe bet. And I can talk more about that later. We also have direct air capture, that negative emissions technology for which there's a pilot project going on in Western Canada right now. Negative emissions technologies like these kind of represent the ultimate wildcard. They could change everything or they could change nothing. Now, the kind of full potential that we model in a subset of our scenarios is really an extreme. It would come with a lot of barriers and hurdles, and we're not suggesting it's a straightforward proposition, but a possibility and a potential that I think is important to note. So we're going to skip ahead now in the usual presentation I do and shine a spotlight on our findings for oil and gas production. Because I think there is this sort of expectation or hope out there on the part of some proponents of this sector that negative emissions could prove to be a pathway to them being part of a net zero future. And we did take a look at that in our analysis. And I'll kind of do the short version of this slide and kind of cut to the chase, which is that we find that there are larger factors that are going to determine the fate of Canada's oil and gas sector. Global EV sales, production in other countries, global climate policy, the concerns of investors, all of these could constrain global demand for fossil fuels and create challenges for Canada's oil and gas sector. And in fact, in a low oil price environment where there's low global demand, we see production in Canada's oil and gas sector falling significantly on the path to net zero. So the sector could face challenges independent of any net zero target. We find that for a thriving oil and gas sector to be part of a net zero future, that for continued production, that red wedge up there, you need 4 conditions to come to pass. So first, you need prices to rise above their current levels and stay high. Second, you need an expectation of this on the part of oil companies and their lenders to drive the continued investment necessary to maintain and grow production capacity on the path to net zero. You also need some of that investment to go towards continued improvements in emissions intensity, so driving down those GHGs per barrel. But fourth and most significantly, you need those negative emissions technologies like direct air capture paired with CCS to prove viable and cost effective and get deployed at scale domestically. Now, in the event you don't get all 4 of those conditions, but you say you got high prices, we might see more sustained production of oil and gas on the path in the medium term. But we would expect that production to fall off very significantly on the path to net zero, really underscoring the risk of stranded assets. So to put all this another way, we find that for oil and gas in Canada to be consistent with a net zero target, you need net zero production emissions and continued international demand. Now, that relies in part on uncertain technological advancement. So no guarantees there, certainly a lot of hurdles. And that continued international demand is going to require either global deployment of negative emissions, so in a massive, massive degree that all countries are adopting these or trading in them, or failing that, weaker global climate action abroad in order to facilitate more sustained use of fossil fuels and continuing Canadian exports, but also the more severe climate change impacts that would carry. So it really underscores that there are challenges for oil and gas in the context of a net zero transition, but also outside the context of one. To our mind, that really underscores the importance of economic diversification. And what we find there is that a net zero transition itself can present opportunities for diversification. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but just to note that things like hydrogen, biofuels, non-emitting electricity, electric vehicles, these all become important growth areas in themselves. And in fact, there's alignment with the infrastructure, resources, and know-how that exists in Canada's oil producing regions. So not to suggest there's a straightforward transition there, but there is alignment and opportunities that could be seized. So the last thing I wanted to shine a spotlight on is our findings around net zero energy systems. So kind of looking forward to the destination. What does net zero energy look like for Canada? And what we find there is that there's actually 3 possibilities for a country like Canada. And we're unique in having so many options. It's by virtue of our landmass, our resources, our infrastructure. Now, these are not equally likely, but they are all possibilities. At the same time, they would also all have to overcome significant barriers. So the first is a fossil fuels plus negative emissions energy system. So technologies like direct air capture. This might enable more maintained or even increased fossil fuel use in Canada, that increase being a really extreme scenario, obviously. This might carry less structural change in the economy and present opportunities for Western Canada. But there are big barriers with a system like this. The technology is in early days, public opposition is likely to be a barrier. And there are big questions about whether any any negative emissions capacity should be reserved for the net negative emissions most global assessments say is ultimately going to be necessary, as Christian was talking about, or may ultimately be necessary. So a lot of barriers with a system like this, but still a possibility we should take seriously. The second is a biofuels energy system. So moving away from those current feedstocks and making RNG out of renewable natural gas, out of things like wood waste, perhaps, liquid biofuels out of things like switchgrass. Early days for technologies like that, but important opportunities with a system like this that there's existing know-how and capacity to build on in biofuel production and refining. And this system could leverage the existing fuel transport infrastructure in place in Canada. So pipelines, refueling networks, doesn't require all the capital stock and infrastructure turnover everywhere that some other systems might. But big barriers here as well. A massive land use footprint, serious questions about the ultimate cost and viability of the technology. But again, a potentially viable future we should take seriously. Now, the third is an electrification plus hydrogen energy system. So there you're talking about electrification of most end uses of energy, hydrogen for some particular applications like in industry and freight and as a form of energy storage. So with a system like this, you're talking about a huge build out of electricity generation and transmission capacity, making hydrogen out of renewable energy to make green hydrogen, or natural gas and CCS to make blue hydrogen. But big barriers with a system like this as well. So this build out we're talking about would involve tons of projects, each with unique approval processes. Grids would have to evolve significantly to manage a much more complex relationship between supply and demand. And you need hydrogen infrastructure, so pipelines, refueling networks. So like the rest, not a simple proposition, but a potentially viable one. Now, I've talked about all three of these in isolation. Of course, it's possible we'll end up with some mix of these, that different sectors, different regions might adopt different solutions. And in fact, that's what we see in many of our scenarios. In particular, that third system of electrification plus hydrogen grows no matter what. So even if negative emissions were to work out in a big way, that system would continue to grow on the path to net zero. So I have additional slides that I could go through, but I'll stop here in the interest of time. Happy to share the deck. It's got some infographics on these systems, some more information, and some of our key findings are summarized there, but maybe I'll just stop there in the interest of time.